The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William stepped out of his private study, his mind already focused on the day ahead. It was October 2023, and the heir to the British throne had been preparing for months for what would become one of the most significant conservation gatherings of the decade. The United for Wildlife Global Summit was just days away, and William knew that the decisions made during those crucial meetings could determine the fate of endangered species across the globe. As he walked through the palace corridors, William's thoughts drifted to his late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had passed away just over a year earlier. She had been a passionate advocate for wildlife conservation, though her efforts had often been overshadowed by her ceremonial duties. Now, as the Prince of Wales, William felt the weight of continuing that legacy while carving out his own path in the conservation world. The idea for the United for Wildlife Global Summit had been brewing in William's mind for nearly 3 years. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of illegal wildlife trade during his visits to Africa, where he had seen elephant carcasses stripped of their tusks and rhinoceros horns brutally hacked off. The images haunted him, but more than that, they motivated him to action. His private secretary, Simon Case, entered the study carrying a thick folder filled with briefing documents. The summit would bring together world leaders, conservationists, law enforcement officials, and technology innovators from over 50 countries. The goal was ambitious: to create a unified global strategy to combat wildlife trafficking, which had become a $4 billion illegal industry, ranking fourth behind drugs, weapons, and human trafficking. William opened the first document in the folder, which outlined the current state of wildlife crime across different continents. The statistics were sobering. In Africa, elephant populations had declined by 60% over the past decade. Rhinoceros numbers had dropped to fewer than 27,000 worldwide. Pangolins, often called the world's most trafficked mammal, faced near extinction with over 1 million individuals removed from the wild in the past 10 years. But the crisis extended far beyond Africa's iconic megafauna. In Asia, tigers numbered fewer than 4,000 in the wild, down from 100,000 a century ago. South America's jaguar populations were declining rapidly due to habitat destruction and illegal hunting. Even in Europe and North America, wildlife trafficking networks were thriving, with everything from rare birds to exotic reptiles being smuggled across borders. The prince had spent countless hours studying these reports, but he knew that numbers alone wouldn't move world leaders to action. He needed to present the human cost of wildlife crime as well. The illegal trade was directly linked to terrorist organizations, drug cartels, and armed militia groups who used wildlife trafficking to fund their operations. Communities that depended on wildlife tourism for their livelihoods were being devastated. Park rangers and conservationists were being murdered for trying to protect endangered species. William's involvement in wildlife conservation had begun during his gap year in 2000, when he worked with British schools exploring society in Chile and later spent time in Kenya. Those early experiences had opened his eyes to the interconnectedness of wildlife, local communities, and global economics. He had seen how conservation efforts could provide sustainable livelihoods for people while protecting endangered species. Over the years, his commitment had deepened through his work with various conservation organizations. In 2013, he had launched United for Wildlife, a collaboration between several of the world's most influential wildlife charities. The organization focused on 3 main areas: reducing demand for illegal wildlife products, strengthening law enforcement, and improving international cooperation. The upcoming summit represented the culmination of a decade's worth of relationship building and strategic planning. William had personally reached out to heads of state, corporate leaders, and conservation heroes from around the world. He had used his royal platform to shine a spotlight on wildlife crime, speaking at conferences, visiting conservation projects, and meeting with survivors of poaching attacks. One of his most powerful weapons in this fight was his ability to convene unlikely allies. The summit would bring together law enforcement officials from countries that rarely cooperated, technology companies eager to contribute their innovations to conservation efforts, and financial institutions willing to track and block money flows from illegal wildlife trade. As William reviewed the guest list for the summit, he felt a surge of optimism. The president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, had confirmed his attendance, bringing with him first-hand experience of leading anti-poaching efforts in East Africa. The Prime Minister of Vietnam had agreed to participate, representing a country that served as both a transit route and destination for illegal wildlife products. Technology leaders from Silicon Valley would present new tools for tracking wildlife products and disrupting trafficking networks. But perhaps most importantly, the summit would feature the voices of frontline conservationists who risk their lives daily to protect wildlife. William had insisted that these heroes be given prominent speaking roles, not relegated to side panels or photo opportunities. Their stories would provide the emotional core that statistics and policy papers could never capture. The prince's approach to conservation had always been deeply personal. He understood that lasting change required more than good intentions and royal patronage. It needed sustained political commitment, adequate funding, technological innovation, and, most importantly, the engagement of local communities who lived alongside wildlife. During his preparations for the summit, William had traveled extensively, visiting conservation projects and meeting with stakeholders. In Botswana, he had flown with anti-poaching units using helicopters to track elephant herds and intercept poachers. In Tanzania, he had met with former poachers who had been recruited as game wardens. Their intimate knowledge of illegal hunting techniques now used to protect the animals they once hunted. These experiences had reinforced his belief that wildlife conservation was not just an environmental issue, but a matter of global security, economic development, and social justice. The communities most affected by wildlife crime were often the poorest and most marginalized, while the profits flowed to wealthy criminal networks and corrupt officials. The summit agenda reflected this holistic approach to conservation. Sessions would cover everything from strengthening international law enforcement cooperation to developing sustainable alternative livelihoods for communities affected by conservation restrictions. There would be presentations on cutting-edge technology, from DNA analysis techniques that could trace the origin of confiscated ivory to artificial intelligence systems that could monitor vast wilderness areas for signs of illegal activity. William had also insisted on including sessions focused on demand reduction, particularly in Asian markets where rhino horn and elephant ivory were prized for their supposed medicinal properties or as status symbols. These discussions would be delicate, requiring cultural sensitivity while still addressing the urgent need to change consumer behavior. As the sun climbed higher over London, William's phone buzzed with messages from summit organizers around the world. The logistics of bringing together such a diverse group of leaders were complex, involving coordination with security services, diplomatic protocols, and media management. But William had learned from years of royal duties how to navigate these challenges while keeping focus on the substantive goals. The choice of venue for the summit had been carefully considered. Rather than holding it in a traditional conference center, William had selected the Natural History Museum in London, with its iconic architecture and world-renowned collections. The setting would serve as a powerful reminder of what was at stake: the irreplaceable diversity of life on Earth that humans had both the power to destroy and the responsibility to protect. The museum's Hindsey Hall, with its towering Hope the blue whale skeleton suspended from the ceiling, would host the opening ceremony. William had chosen this location because it represented both the majesty of the natural world and the reality of extinction. Blue whales have been hunted to near extinction before conservation efforts helped their populations recover. As William prepared for his final pre-summit briefings, he reflected on how much had changed since he first began speaking about wildlife conservation. When he started, he was often seen as a privileged young man with good intentions, but limited real-world experience. Over the years, he had worked to earn credibility within the conservation community through consistent engagement, careful listening, and strategic use of his platform. He had learned that royal influence, while powerful, had to be wielded carefully. too much pressure could backfire, alienating the very people whose cooperation was essential. Too little, and important opportunities for change would be missed. Finding the right balance required constant recalibration and deep understanding of political dynamics in different countries and contexts. The afternoon brought a series of video calls with summit participants who couldn't travel to London for the pre-meetings. William spoke with a park ranger in the Democratic Republic of Congo who had survived 3 poaching attacks, a technology entrepreneur in Singapore developing blockchain solutions for wildlife product authentication, and a prosecutor in New York who specialized in wildlife trafficking cases. Each conversation reinforced the global scope of the challenge and the need for coordinated response. The park ranger described how criminal networks were becoming more sophisticated, using military-grade weapons and communication equipment. The technology entrepreneur explained how the same digital tools that enabled global commerce could be used to disrupt illegal wildlife trade. The prosecutor outlined how financial investigations were revealing connections between wildlife trafficking and other forms of organized crime. These discussions also highlighted the personal costs of wildlife crime. The park ranger had lost colleagues to poacher attacks and struggled with limited resources and equipment. The prosecutor described the frustration of building strong cases only to see convicted traffickers receive minimal sentences. The entrepreneur shared his motivation, driven by childhood memories of wildlife-rich forests that had been decimated by illegal logging and poaching. As evening approached, William took a moment to walk through Kensington Gardens, observing the wildlife that thrived even in the heart of London. Urban foxes, various bird species, and small mammals had found ways to coexist with the millions of people who called the city home. It was a reminder that conservation wasn't just about remote wilderness areas. It was about reimagining the relationship between humans and nature everywhere. The prince's thoughts turned to his own children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, and what kind of world they would inherit. Would they be able to see elephants and rhinos in the wild, or would these magnificent creatures exist only in zoos and photographs? The urgency of that question drove much of his conservation work. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was Dr. Jane Goodall, the renowned primatologist who would be delivering one of the keynote addresses at the summit. At 90 years old, she remained one of the most powerful voices in conservation, and her participation lent enormous credibility to the gathering. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from the latest research on great ape behavior to strategies for engaging young people in conservation efforts. Dr. Goodall emphasized the importance of hope in conservation messaging. While the challenges were enormous, there were success stories that proved change was possible when people worked together with determination and resources. They discussed the recovery of mountain gorilla populations in Rwanda, the successful reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park, and the ongoing efforts to save the northern white rhinoceros through advanced reproductive technologies. These examples would feature prominently in summit presentations, demonstrating that even species on the brink of extinction could be saved with sufficient commitment and innovation. As William prepared for bed that evening, he reviewed his opening remarks for the summit. He had written and rewritten them multiple times, trying to strike the right balance between urgency and optimism, between acknowledging the magnitude of the challenge and inspiring confidence that it could be overcome. The speech would need to appeal to different audiences simultaneously: world leaders who control policy and budgets, law enforcement officials who risk their lives fighting wildlife crime, conservationists who had dedicated their careers to protecting endangered species, and technology innovators who could provide new tools for the fight. Most importantly, it would need to honor the memory of the countless animals that had already been lost while inspiring action to save those that remained. His final thought before sleep was of an elderly elephant matriarch he had encountered during his last visit to Kenya. She had been walking slowly across the savannah, her massive tusks touching the ground, followed by her extended family. Local guides had told him that she was over 60 years old and had survived decades of poaching pressure that had decimated her species. Her dignity and resilience in the face of such threats embodied everything the summit was trying to protect. The next morning would bring the final preparations for what William hoped would be a turning point in the global fight against wildlife crime. Success would be measured not in photo opportunities or media coverage, but in the concrete commitments and sustained actions that emerged from a gathering. The stakes could not be higher, and failure was not an option for the species hanging in the balance. The morning of the summit's first day arrived with London's typical autumn crispness, but inside the Natural History Museum, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Prince William arrived at 6:30 in the morning, 3 hours before the official opening ceremony, to personally oversee the final preparations and greet early arriving participants. The museum had been transformed overnight into a high-tech conference venue while maintaining its historic grandeur. Interactive displays showing real-time wildlife trafficking data had been installed alongside the museum's permanent exhibits. In the main hall, enormous screens displayed live feeds from national parks across Africa, Asia, and South America, where dawn was breaking over landscapes where the day's conservation battles would soon begin. William's first meeting of the day was with a delegation from the International Criminal Police Organization, known as Interpol. The group included specialized wildlife crime investigators from 12 countries, each bringing unique expertise in tracking illegal wildlife trade networks. Their commander, a veteran French police officer named Marie-Claire Dubois, had spent 20 years investigating transnational organized crime before specializing in wildlife trafficking 5 years earlier. Commander Dubois briefed William on the latest intelligence regarding major trafficking networks operating between Africa and Asia. The criminal organizations had become increasingly sophisticated, using encrypted communications, multiple shell companies to launder money, and corrupt officials at every level of government to facilitate their operations. Most concerning was the evidence that some groups were expanding into other forms of illegal trade, including weapons and drugs, making wildlife trafficking part of broader criminal enterprises. The briefing included disturbing photos and videos confiscated from trafficking networks, showing the brutal reality of how animals were killed and processed for illegal trade. William had seen such images before, but they never failed to steal his resolve. A video from a recent raid in Mozambique showed dozens of elephant carcasses scattered across a watering hole, their tusks removed with chainsaws while their bodies were left to rot in the African sun. But the Interpol delegation also brought encouraging news. Their newly established wildlife crime database had already led to the arrest of over 300 traffickers in the past year. Financial intelligence sharing between countries had resulted in the freezing of millions of dollars in illegal proceeds. Most importantly, several major trafficking kingpins who had operated with impunity for years were now facing prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. William's next meeting was with a group of technology leaders who had volunteered their expertise to the conservation cause. The delegation included executives from companies specializing in satellite imagery, artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, and mobile communications. Their innovations were already being deployed in conservation efforts around the world, but they needed greater coordination and funding to scale up their impact. The satellite imagery company had developed systems that could monitor vast wilderness areas for signs of illegal activity, using machine learning to identify unusual movement patterns that might indicate poaching operations. Their technology had already helped park authorities in several African countries intercept poaching expeditions before they could reach elephant or rhino populations. The artificial intelligence firm had created algorithms that could analyze thousands of online marketplace listings to identify illegal wildlife products being sold on social media platforms and e-commerce websites. Their system had flagged over 10,000 suspicious listings in the past month alone, leading to the removal of advertisements for everything from rhino horn to pangolin scales. Perhaps most innovative was the blockchain company's work on creating tamper-proof certification systems for legal wildlife products. Their technology could provide a complete chain of custody for items like legally harvested timber or sustainably sourced animal products, making it much harder for illegal goods to enter legitimate markets. As William toured the technology displays, he was struck by how rapidly innovation was advancing the conservation toolkit. Drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras could patrol vast areas at night when poachers were most active. Genetic analysis techniques could determine the origin of confiscated ivory or rhino horn within days rather than months. Mobile apps allowed local communities to report suspicious activity directly to park authorities, bypassing potentially corrupt local officials. The morning's most emotional meeting was with a group of frontline conservationists who had traveled from around the world to attend the summit. This included park rangers, community conservation leaders, and wildlife veterinarians who worked directly with endangered species. Many bore physical and emotional scars from their encounters with wildlife criminals, but all remained committed to protecting the animals under their care. Among them was James Mwangi, a senior ranger from Kenya's Masai Mara National Reserve who had survived an ambush by elephant poachers 3 years earlier. 2 of his colleagues had been killed in the attack, and James himself had spent months recovering from gunshot wounds. Despite the trauma, he had returned to his duties and had since become a leading advocate for better protection and equipment for park rangers. James described to William the daily reality of working in areas where heavily armed criminal groups operated with military-level tactics and equipment. Rangers often found themselves outgunned and outnumbered, equipped with basic radios and aging rifles while facing criminals with automatic weapons, night vision equipment, and sophisticated communication systems. The psychological pressure was immense, knowing that their families could become targets if they were too successful in disrupting poaching operations. But James also shared success stories that illustrated the impact of international cooperation. A recent operation supported by Interpol intelligence and funded by private donors had led to the arrest of a major poaching network that had been responsible for killing over 200 elephants in the previous year. The operation had required coordination between Kenyan authorities, international law enforcement, and local community leaders who provided crucial intelligence about the criminals' movements. Another participant in this meeting was Dr. Sarah Mthembu, a wildlife veterinarian from South Africa who specialized in treating animals injured by poachers. Her work included performing life-saving surgery on rhinos whose horns had been partially removed, treating elephants wounded by snares and poisoned arrows, and providing trauma care for animals affected by habitat destruction caused by illegal mining and logging operations. Dr. Mthembu had documented the evolution of poaching techniques over her 15-year career, noting how criminals have become more brutal and indiscriminate in their methods. Modern poaching operations often use cyanide to poison water sources, killing not just target species, but entire ecosystem food chains. Helicopter-mounted firearms allowed poachers to conduct aerial hunts that were nearly impossible to prevent or prosecute. Her most heartbreaking cases involved young animals orphaned by poaching attacks. She had helped establish rehabilitation centers for elephant and rhino calves whose mothers had been killed for their tusks or horns. These facilities not only provided care for traumatized animals, but also served as powerful symbols of the human cost of wildlife crime, attracting international attention and funding for broader conservation efforts. As the official opening ceremony approached, William took a few moments to review his remarks one final time. The speech had evolved significantly from his initial draft, incorporating insights from his morning meetings and conversations with summit participants. He wanted to acknowledge the brutal reality of wildlife crime while inspiring hope that coordinated international action could turn the tide. The ceremony began with a moment of silence for the countless animals lost to illegal trafficking and the human heroes who had given their lives protecting wildlife. The silence was broken by the haunting sound of elephant calls recorded in the wild, a reminder of what the summit participants were fighting to preserve. William's opening address was broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, with simultaneous translation into 15 languages. He began by sharing the story of the elderly elephant matriarch he had encountered in Kenya, using her resilience as a metaphor for the conservation movement's determination to survive and thrived despite overwhelming challenges. The prince outlined 3 key goals for the summit: strengthening international law enforcement cooperation, leveraging technology and innovation for conservation, and addressing the root causes that drove both wildlife crime and the community's vulnerability to it. He emphasized that success would require sustained commitment beyond the 3-day gathering, with concrete actions and measurable outcomes. His most powerful moment came when he introduced several of the frontline conservationists in the audience, asking them to stand and be recognized for their courage and dedication. The sustained applause from the distinguished international audience provided emotional validation for people whose dangerous and often thankless work rarely received global recognition. The speech concluded with Williams' announcement of several major new initiatives that would be launched during the summit. These included a $100 million international fund for ranger training and equipment, a new intelligence sharing platform linking law enforcement agencies across 50 countries, and a consumer awareness campaign targeting key markets for illegal wildlife products. The ceremony's final element was the unveiling of a digital memorial wall displaying photos and brief biographies of park rangers, conservationists, and wildlife veterinarians who had been killed protecting endangered species. The wall would remain permanently installed at the museum, ensuring that their sacrifices would be remembered by the millions of visitors who would see it in the years to come. Following the opening ceremony, participants divided into specialized working groups focused on specific aspects of wildlife crime. William moved between these sessions, listening to detailed discussions about everything from forensic techniques for identifying illegal wildlife product to strategies for engaging young people in conservation efforts. The Law Enforcement Working Group was developing protocols for rapid information sharing when major trafficking operations were detected. Previously, bureaucratic delays and territorial disputes between agencies had allowed criminals to move products across borders before authorities could coordinate responses. The new system would enable real-time intelligence sharing with automatic alerts when certain trigger events occurred. The Technology Working Group was designing an integrated platform that would combine satellite monitoring, on-ground sensor networks, and community reporting systems into a comprehensive early warning system for wildlife crime. The ambitious project would require significant funding and technical coordination, but pilot programs in several African countries had already demonstrated its potential effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the Community Engagement Working Group was developing strategies for ensuring that local populations benefited from conservation efforts rather than being displaced or marginalized by them. Too many conservation programs had failed because they ignored the needs and rights of people who lived alongside wildlife, creating resentment that criminal networks could exploit. The day's most innovative session focused on financial investigations and asset recovery. Specialists from banking institutions, government financial intelligence units, and anti-money laundering organizations outlined new techniques for tracking illegal wildlife profits through complex international financial networks. Several major banks had committed to implementing new screening systems that would flag suspicious transactions potentially linked to wildlife trafficking. One particularly promising development was the use of artificial intelligence to analyze vast quantities of financial data for patterns associated with wildlife crime. The system had already identified several previously unknown trafficking networks by detecting unusual money flows between countries with high poaching rates and markets with strong demand for illegal wildlife products. As the first day concluded with a reception in the museum's main hall, William reflected on the progress already evident in the discussions and commitments emerging from the summit. The gathering had succeeded in bringing together people who rarely had opportunities to collaborate, creating new partnerships and accelerating existing initiatives. The conversations overheard throughout the reception demonstrated the summit's impact. Technology innovators were exchanging contact information with park rangers who could test their products in real-world conditions. Law enforcement officers from different countries were comparing notes on trafficking techniques and successful prosecution strategies. Government officials were negotiating bilateral agreements for enhanced cooperation on wildlife crime investigations. But William knew that the real test would come after the summit ended, and participants returned to their regular responsibilities. Too many international conferences produced impressive declarations and photo opportunities, but limited lasting change. His team had built accountability mechanisms into the summit process, with specific commitments that would be publicly tracked and progress reports required every 6 months. The prince's final meetings of the day were with representatives from several African countries that served as source areas for much of the illegal wildlife trade. These leaders faced complex challenges, balancing conservation goals with economic development needs and political pressures from communities affected by both wildlife crime and conservation restrictions. The president of Botswana outlined his country's controversial but effective approach to wildlife protection, which included authorizing park rangers to use lethal force against armed poachers. The policy had dramatically reduced elephant poaching, but had also drawn criticism from human rights organizations concerned about due process and proportional response. Kenya's delegation described their innovative community conservancy programs, which gave local populations direct financial stakes in wildlife protection through tourism revenue sharing and employment in conservation activities. These programs had reduced human-wildlife conflict while creating sustainable alternatives to poaching and habitat destruction. Mozambique's representatives discussed the challenges of protecting wildlife in areas affected by ongoing armed conflict and weak government control. Criminal networks took advantage of security vacuums to establish poaching operations that helped fund larger destabilization efforts, creating cycles of violence that made traditional conservation approaches ineffective. As William prepared to leave the museum that evening, he took a final walk through the exhibition halls where participants continued networking and developing collaborative projects. The energy and commitment evident in these conversations gave him hope that the summit would indeed mark a turning point in global conservation efforts. The day had reinforced his belief that wildlife protection required much more than good intentions and symbolic gestures. It demanded sustained political will, adequate resources, technological innovation, and, most importantly, genuine partnership with the communities most affected by both wildlife crime and conservation efforts. The summit had brought together all these elements in unprecedented ways, but transforming that potential into lasting change would require continued effort long after the cameras and media attention moved on to other issues. The second day of the United for Wildlife Global Summit began before sunrise with urgent news from the field. William arrived at the Natural History Museum to find his security team in discussion with Interpol officials about a developing situation in Tanzania. A major poaching operation had been intercepted during the night, with early intelligence suggesting it might be connected to one of the criminal networks under discussion at the summit. The intercepted operation provided a real-time case study for the day sessions, which focused on operational coordination and rapid response protocols. Within hours of the initial report, summit participants were able to observe how international cooperation could work when properly coordinated. Tanzanian authorities had requested assistance from Interpol, which had immediately shared intelligence with law enforcement agencies in Kenya, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo to prevent the trafficking network from simply shifting operations across borders. William began the day by meeting with a delegation of prosecutors and judges from countries where wildlife trafficking cases were often prosecuted. This group included some of the world's most experienced legal professionals in combating wildlife crime, but their stories revealed the enormous challenges faced by the judicial system in dealing with these cases. Judge Patricia Komu from South Africa described how wildlife trafficking cases often became entangled with corruption at every level of the legal system. Defense attorneys with unlimited resources faced overwhelmed prosecutors with minimal budgets and limited expertise in wildlife law. Key witnesses, including park rangers and community informants, faced intimidation and death threats that made them reluctant to testify. Evidence collection in remote areas where poaching occurred was often compromised by inadequate forensic capabilities and long delays in processing. Perhaps most frustrating was the inconsistency in sentencing across different jurisdictions. A trafficking kingpin might face decades in prison if prosecuted in one country, but receive only a fine or brief detention if tried elsewhere. Criminal networks exploited these disparities by operating through countries with weaker legal frameworks or higher levels of corruption. The delegation had drafted model legislation that could be adapted by different countries to strengthen their wildlife crime laws and ensure more consistent prosecution standards. The proposed framework included minimum sentences for different categories of wildlife crimes, enhanced penalties for repeat offenders and organized criminal groups, and provisions for international asset forfeiture and recovery. Williams' next session was with representatives from major international banks and financial institutions who were pioneering new approaches to disrupting wildlife trafficking finance networks. The financial sector had been reluctant to engage with conservation issues for years, viewing them as outside their core business concerns. But mounting evidence of links between wildlife trafficking and other forms of organized crime, including money laundering and terrorist financing, had motivated increased attention and cooperation. The banks had developed sophisticated algorithms that could identify suspicious transaction patterns potentially linked to wildlife trafficking. Large cash deposits in areas near national parks, frequent transfers to accounts in countries known as wildlife product destinations, and payments to shell companies with no legitimate business purpose were among the red flags that triggered investigations. One particularly successful case study involved a trafficking network that had been moving elephant ivory from Central Africa to markets in Southeast Asia. Financial investigators had identified unusual money flows from legitimate logging companies to accounts controlled by known criminal associates. When this intelligence was shared with law enforcement agencies, it led to the discovery that the logging operations were fronts for large-scale elephant poaching, with ivory being smuggled in shipments of legal timber. The financial institutions had committed to expanding their anti-wildlife trafficking programs, but they needed better intelligence sharing with law enforcement agencies and clearer guidance on regulatory requirements. Many banks wanted to do more, but were constrained by privacy laws and concerns about liability if they took aggressive action against suspected criminal accounts. The technology session that followed showcased some of the most innovative tools being developed to combat wildlife crime. A startup company from Israel demonstrated their acoustic monitoring system, which could detect the sounds of gunshots, chainsaws, and vehicle engines in protected areas from distances of up to 20 kilometers. The system used artificial intelligence to distinguish between legal activities like ranger patrols and illegal activities like poaching operations. The acoustic monitors had already been deployed in several African national parks with remarkable results. In one case, the system had detected a poaching expedition entering a protected area at night and had automatically alerted park authorities, who were able to intercept the poachers before they reached an elephant herd. The technology was particularly valuable because it worked continuously in all weather conditions and could cover vast areas with relatively few devices. Another company presented their work on developing genetic databases that could trace the origin of confiscated wildlife products with unprecedented precision. Traditional methods for determining where ivory or rhino horn had been harvested were time-consuming and often inconclusive. The new genetic techniques could identify not just the country, but sometimes the specific region where an animal had lived, providing crucial evidence for prosecution and intelligence about trafficking routes. The genetic work had already yielded surprising insights about wildlife trafficking patterns. Analysis of confiscated ivory had revealed that some shipments contained product from animals killed decades apart, indicating that criminals maintained stockpiles and mixed old inventory with fresh products to confuse law enforcement investigations. This discovery had led to new investigative approaches focusing on storage facilities and distribution networks rather than just hunting operations. William was particularly interested in a presentation about using blockchain technology to create tamper-proof certificates for legal wildlife products. The system could provide complete chain of custody documentation from the point of legal harvest through processing, distribution, and final sale. Consumers could scan a simple code to verify that products were legitimate, while authorities could quickly identify illegal goods that lacked proper certification. The blockchain system was being piloted with legal timber exports from sustainably managed forests in several African countries. Early results suggested that the technology could help legitimate businesses compete more effectively against illegal operators while providing consumers with confidence that their purchases weren't contributing to deforestation or corruption. The day's most emotionally powerful session brought together families affected by wildlife crime, including relatives of park rangers killed in the line of duty and community members whose livelihoods have been devastated by poaching and habitat destruction. Their testimonies provided stark reminders of the human cost of wildlife trafficking that often received less attention than the impact on endangered species. Mary Katindi from Kenya spoke about her husband's murder by elephant poachers 5 years earlier. He had been a senior ranger with over 20 years of experience, known throughout the region for his tracking skills and dedication to wildlife protection. The poachers had ambushed his patrol unit, killing him and 2 colleagues execution style after they had discovered evidence of a major ivory operation. The aftermath of the attack had been devastating for the families and the broader conservation community. Mary had been left to raise 3 children alone on a ranger's pension that was barely adequate for basic survival. The killings had intimidated other rangers, leading to increased turnover and reduced patrols in some of the most critical conservation areas. Several experienced rangers had left for safer jobs in urban areas, taking their expertise and local knowledge with them. But Mary had channeled her grief into advocacy, working to improve safety equipment and training for park rangers while pushing for stronger prosecution of those who attack conservation personnel. Her efforts had contributed to new policies requiring better bulletproof vests, communication equipment, and emergency medical training for rangers in high-risk areas. Another speaker was David Nalakwego from Uganda, whose community had been forced to relocate when their traditional lands were incorporated into a national park. While he supported conservation goals, he described how the displacement had disrupted generations of sustainable resource management practices and left many families struggling with poverty and loss of cultural identity. David's story illustrated the complex relationship between conservation and human rights that had complicated many protection efforts. Top-down conservation approaches that excluded local communities had often created resentment and conflict that criminal networks could exploit. Successful conservation required finding ways to protect wildlife while respecting indigenous rights and providing sustainable alternatives for communities that had traditionally depended on natural resources. The community representatives had drafted a charter outlining principles for inclusive conservation that ensured local populations benefited from and participated in wildlife protection efforts. The charter emphasized the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, community ownership of conservation initiatives, and equitable sharing of tourism and other revenues generated by protected areas. William's afternoon was spent in one-on-one meetings with heads of state and government ministers from countries across Africa and Asia. These conversations focused on the political commitment and policy changes needed to support the technical and operational initiatives being developed at the summit. His meeting with the president of Vietnam was particularly significant, given that country's role as both a transit route and destination for illegal wildlife products. Vietnamese criminal organizations have become major players in rhino horn and pangolin trafficking, while traditional medicine markets in major cities continued to create demand for illegal animal products despite government efforts to reduce consumption. The president acknowledged that Vietnam faced complex challenges in combating wildlife trafficking, including corruption among border officials, sophisticated criminal networks with international connections, and cultural traditions that made demand reduction difficult. However, he committed to new enforcement measures, including specialized wildlife crime courts and enhanced penalties for trafficking offenses. More significantly, the president announced Vietnam's agreement to join a new multilateral intelligence sharing initiative that would enable real-time coordination between law enforcement agencies across Southeast Asia. This represented a major breakthrough, as Vietnam had previously been reluctant to participate in such arrangements due to concerns about sovereignty and intelligence security. William's conversation with the Prime Minister of India focused on that country's efforts to protect tiger populations, which had shown encouraging recovery in recent years, but remained vulnerable to poaching pressure driven by demand for bones and other body parts in traditional medicine markets. India had pioneered some of the most sophisticated anti-poaching technologies, including camera trap networks that provided real-time monitoring of tiger movements and artificial intelligence systems that could identify individual animals and track their territories. The Prime Minister described India's community-based conservation programs, which had transformed former poachers into wildlife protectors by providing alternative employment in ecotourism and park management. These programs have been particularly successful in reducing human-tiger conflict while creating economic incentives for conservation among rural communities. However, India continued to face challenges from international trafficking networks that targeted tiger product for export to China and Southeast Asia. The Prime Minister requested enhanced international cooperation in tracking these networks and prosecuting their leaders, many of whom operated from outside India's jurisdiction. The day's final major session focused on developing sustainable financing mechanisms for conservation efforts. Traditional funding approaches relied heavily on donor governments and international conservation organizations, creating uncertainty and limiting the scale of protection efforts. The summit participants were exploring innovative financing models that could provide more stable and substantial resources for wildlife protection. One promising approach involved the development of conservation bonds that would pay returns based on measurable conservation outcomes, such as increases in wildlife populations or reductions in poaching incidents. Several major investment firms had expressed interest in these instruments, viewing them as opportunities to generate both financial returns and positive environmental impact. Another innovative mechanism being discussed was the creation of payment systems for ecosystem services that would compensate communities and countries for protecting wildlife habitats. These programs would provide direct financial incentives for conservation while recognizing the economic value of intact ecosystems for global climate regulation, water purification, and biodiversity preservation. The financing discussions also addressed the need for debt relief and restructuring for developing countries that were struggling to fund conservation efforts while meeting other development priorities. Several European governments had indicated willingness to consider debt-for-nature swaps that would forgive portions of international debt in exchange for enhanced wildlife protection commitments. As the second day concluded, William participated in a live global broadcast that connected the summit with conservation projects around the world. The broadcast included live feeds from national parks in Kenya, India, and Costa Rica, where local conservationists described their work and the challenges they faced. The global audience was able to see elephants, tigers, and jaguars in their natural habitats while learning about the threats these species faced and the efforts being made to protect them. The broadcast concluded with commitments from several major corporations to eliminate illegal wildlife products from their supply chains and invest in conservation technology development. Technology companies committed to providing free or discounted services for conservation organizations, while transportation companies agreed to enhance screening procedures for shipments that might contain illegal wildlife products. The evening's private dinner brought together a smaller group of key participants for more detailed discussions about implementation strategies and accountability mechanisms. William used this setting to secure specific commitments from heads of state and organizational leaders, moving beyond general statements of support to concrete actions with timelines and measurable goals. The dinner conversation revealed the complexity of translating summit agreements into lasting change. Each participant faced unique domestic political pressures, budget constraints, and institutional limitations that would affect their ability to implement new policies and programs. Success would require not just initial commitments, but sustained support through changes in government leadership and shifting political priorities. William concluded the day with a sense of momentum building around the summit's core initiatives. The combination of technological innovation, financial resources, political commitment, and community engagement was creating unprecedented opportunities for progress in wildlife protection. But he also recognized that the real work would begin after the summit ended, when the international attention moved on to other issues and participants returned to the daily challenges of implementing change within their respective organizations and countries. The intelligence from the Tanzania poaching operation that had begun the day continued to develop throughout the evening, with early reports suggesting that the international coordination facilitated by summit participants had prevented what might have been one of the largest ivory trafficking operations in recent years. If confirmed, this success would provide powerful validation of the cooperation frameworks being developed at the summit and demonstrate their potential for real-world impact. The third and final day of the United for Wildlife Global Summit dawned with news that would dramatically illustrate both the potential and the urgency of international cooperation in wildlife protection. The Tanzania operation that had been developing throughout the conference had resulted in the arrest of 18 suspected poachers and traffickers, the seizure of over 200 kilograms of ivory and rhino horn, and the discovery of evidence linking the network to criminal organizations in 4 different countries. William arrived at the Natural History Museum to find an atmosphere of cautious celebration mixed with renewed determination. The success demonstrated that the coordination mechanisms being developed at the summit could work, but it also revealed the enormous scale of the criminal networks operating across international borders. Intelligence gathered during the operation suggested that the arrested individuals were part of a larger organization responsible for killing hundreds of elephants and dozens of rhinos across East Africa. The day began with a detailed briefing on the Tanzania operation, presented jointly by Interpol officials and Tanzanian law enforcement authorities. The case provided a real-world laboratory for analyzing how different elements of the anti-trafficking strategy discussed at the summit could work together in practice. The operation had begun with intelligence from a community conservation program that trained local residents to report suspicious activities. Villagers near Serengeti National Park had noticed unusual vehicle movements at night and had used a mobile app developed by one of the summit's technology partners to alert park authorities. This initial report had triggered a coordinated response involving multiple agencies and technologies. Satellite monitoring systems had tracked the vehicle's movements, while acoustic sensors had detected the sounds of gunshots and chainsaws in the protected area. Park rangers equipped with new communication equipment had been able to coordinate their response with specialized anti-poaching units, while financial intelligence had identified suspicious money transfers that helped investigators understand the operation's funding and organization structure. The arrests had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, including encrypted communications equipment, detailed maps of trafficking routes, and financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. Most importantly, the suspects had provided information about their superiors and international connections, opening possibilities for follow-up operations in other countries. William was particularly interested in the role that community informants had played in initiating the operation. The success reinforced his belief that sustainable conservation required genuine partnership with local populations rather than top-down approaches that excluded affected communities. The villagers who had reported the suspicious activity were eligible for reward from a fund established by international donors, providing concrete incentives for community participation in wildlife protection. The morning's first major session focused on developing concrete implementation plans for the initiatives that had emerged from the summit discussions. Working groups had spent the previous evening drafting detailed proposals with specific timelines, funding requirements, and accountability measures. These plans would form the foundation for the summit's final declarations and ongoing cooperation agreements. The Law Enforcement Working Group had designed a new international intelligence sharing platform that would connect wildlife crime investigators from 50 countries in real time. The system would enable automatic alerts when certain trigger events occurred, such as the seizure of large quantities of ivory or the identification of known trafficking suspects crossing international borders. Pilot testing would begin within 3 months, with full implementation planned for the following year. The Technology Working Group had outlined an integrated monitoring system that would combine satellite imagery, acoustic sensors, community reporting apps, and artificial intelligence analysis to create comprehensive early warning networks for protected areas. The system would be initially deployed in 10 high-priority conservation areas across Africa and Asia, with expansion dependent on performance and available funding. Perhaps most ambitiously, the Financing Working Group had structured a new conservation impact fund that would mobilize over $2 billion for wildlife protection efforts over the next 5 years. The fund would combine contributions from government donors, private foundations, and innovative financial instruments including conservation bonds and payment for ecosystem services programs. William participated in detailed negotiations over the fund's governance structure and investment priorities. He insisted that funding decisions include substantial input from frontline conservationists and affected communities, rather than being made solely by donors and financial institutions. This approach reflected lessons learned from previous conservation initiatives that had failed because they ignored local knowledge and priorities. The fund would prioritize support for community-based conservation programs, ranger training and equipment, technology development and deployment, and legal system strengthening. Importantly, it would also provide emergency support for conservation personnel and their families affected by wildlife crime violence, addressing a critical gap in current protection frameworks. One of the day's most significant developments was the announcement of several major corporate partnerships that would extend the summit's impact into the private sector. Technology companies committed to providing free cloud, computing, and communication services for conservation organizations, while logistics companies agreed to enhance screening procedures for shipments that might contain illegal wildlife products. More importantly, several major retailers and e-commerce platforms committed to implementing new screening systems that would prevent illegal wildlife product from being sold through their channels. These companies had been reluctant to take such steps previously due to concerns about liability and implementation costs, but mounting public pressure and improved detection technologies had made action both necessary and feasible. The corporate partnerships included groundbreaking agreements with social media platforms to remove advertisements and posts promoting illegal wildlife products. These companies would implement artificial intelligence systems that could identify and automatically remove content offering rhino horn, ivory, pangolin scales, and other illegal products. The technology had been tested on a smaller scale and had proven highly effective at identifying such content while minimizing false positives that might affect legitimate posts. Williams' afternoon was dominated by bilateral meetings with key participants to secure final commitments and address remaining obstacles to implementation. These conversations revealed the complex political and practical challenges that would affect the summit's long-term success, but also demonstrated the unprecedented level of commitment that had been generated by the 3-day gathering. His meeting with Chinese officials was particularly crucial, given China's role as the world's largest market for many illegal wildlife products. The delegation included both government representatives and leaders from traditional medicine associations who had the influence to affect consumer behavior and industry practices. The Chinese commitment to closing domestic ivory markets had been a major conservation victory, but significant demand remained for rhino horn, pangolin scales, and other products. The officials outlined new educational campaigns targeting traditional medicine practitioners and consumers, emphasizing both the conservation impact and the availability of effective synthetic alternatives. More significantly, China committed to joining the new international intelligence sharing platform and providing financial support for anti-poaching efforts in Africa. This represented a major shift in Chinese policy, which had previously focused primarily on domestic demand reduction rather than international cooperation in addressing supply-side factors. The meeting with United States representatives focused on that country's leadership role in providing technology, financial resources, and diplomatic pressure to support conservation efforts. The U.S. had already committed substantial resources to anti-poaching initiatives, but summit participants had requested enhanced cooperation in tracking financial flows and prosecuting international trafficking networks. The U.S. delegation announced new initiatives that would significantly expand American support for wildlife protection. These included increased funding for park ranger training and equipment, enhanced intelligence sharing with international partners, and the deployment of advanced surveillance technologies in key conservation areas. Perhaps most importantly, the U.S. committed to using its economic leverage to pressure countries that served as major transit routes for illegal wildlife products. This would include considering trade sanctions and other economic measures against countries that failed to take adequate action against wildlife trafficking networks operating within their borders. The European Union representatives outlined ambitious new legislation that would strengthen import controls for wildlife products and increase penalties for trafficking offenses. The EU would also provide substantial funding for conservation efforts in Africa and Asia, while using its development aid programs to support community-based conservation initiatives. The afternoon's most emotional session brought together young conservation leaders from around the world to discuss strategies for engaging the next generation in wildlife protection efforts. These individuals, ranging in age from their early teens to late 20s, brought fresh perspectives and innovative ideas that challenged conventional approaches to conservation. The young leaders emphasized the importance of using social media and digital platforms to raise awareness about wildlife crime and mobilize support for protection efforts. They had already demonstrated the power of these approaches through viral campaigns that had generated millions of views and significant policy changes in several countries. Their presentations included innovative projects such as virtual reality experiences that allowed people to witness the impact of poaching firsthand, mobile games that taught players about wildlife conservation challenges, and online marketplaces for sustainable products that provided alternatives to items derived from endangered species. William was particularly impressed by a presentation from a group of teenagers from Kenya who had developed a mobile app that gamified wildlife protection by allowing users to adopt specific animals and track their protection status through GPS monitoring and camera trap images. The app had attracted over 1 million users worldwide and had generated significant funding for park protection efforts. The young leaders also brought sobering perspectives about the urgency of conservation action. Many had grown up in areas where wildlife populations had declined dramatically during their lifetimes, providing them with firsthand experience of what was being lost. Their presentations included powerful before and after images showing how landscapes and wildlife populations had changed over the past decade. But the young leaders also brought optimism and energy that proved infectious throughout the summit. Their commitment to conservation was absolute, uncompromised by the political and economic considerations that often constrained adult decision-makers. They viewed wildlife protection not as one issue among many, but as a fundamental prerequisite for their generation's future. The day's final session focused on accountability mechanisms and ongoing coordination to ensure that summit commitments would be translated into sustained action. William announced the establishment of a permanent secretariat that would track progress on all summit initiatives and provide regular public reports on implementation status. The accountability system included specific metrics for each major initiative, with quarterly progress reports and annual summits to assess achievements and address obstacles. Participants committed to transparency in reporting their progress, with both successes and failures being shared publicly to facilitate learning and improvement. The system also included financial accountability mechanisms to ensure that pledged resources were actually delivered and effectively used. Major donors committed to multi-year funding agreements rather than single-year grants, providing greater stability and predictability for conservation organizations and affected communities. The summit's closing ceremony took place in the museum's main hall, with participants gathered beneath the suspended blue whale skeleton that had witnessed 3 days of intensive negotiations and commitment-making. William delivered closing remarks that summarized the unprecedented agreements that had been reached, while emphasizing that the real work would begin after participants returned home. The ceremony included the formal signing of the United for Wildlife Global Accord, a comprehensive agreement outlining the commitments made by governments, organizations, and private sector participants. The accord represented the most ambitious international wildlife protection agreement in history, with specific targets for reducing wildlife trafficking, protecting endangered species, and supporting affected communities. The signing was witnessed by representatives from over 50 countries, major international organizations, technology companies, financial institutions, and conservation groups. The diversity of signatories reflected the broad coalition that had been assembled around wildlife protection, spanning traditional boundaries between government and civil society, developed and developing countries, and different industry sectors. The ceremony concluded with live video connections to conservation projects around the world where the summit's impact was already beginning to be felt. Rangers in Kenya described new equipment and training they would receive through summit commitments. Community leaders in Indonesia outlined sustainable development projects that would be funded through the new Conservation Impact Fund. Technology innovators in Silicon Valley demonstrated systems that were being deployed to monitor trafficking networks. As participants began to disperse, William reflected on what had been accomplished during the 3 intensive days. The summit had succeeded in creating unprecedented cooperation between groups that had rarely worked together effectively. Governments had committed to specific policy changes with clear timelines. Technology companies had pledged substantial resources and expertise. Financial institutions had agreed to enhance screening and investigation procedures. But perhaps most importantly, the summit had created a sense of shared urgency and collective responsibility that transcended national and organizational boundaries. Participants left with personal relationships and communication channels that would facilitate ongoing cooperation long after the formal summit structure ended. The evening brought a final private dinner for key participants, providing an opportunity for informal conversation and relationship building that would support future cooperation. These personal connections often proved more valuable than formal agreements in sustaining collaboration through changing political circumstances and institutional priorities. William spent the evening moving between different groups, reinforcing key commitments, and addressing final concerns about implementation. He was particularly focused on ensuring that frontline conservationists and community representatives felt supported and empowered to contribute to ongoing efforts rather than being marginalized once international attention moved on to other issues. As the summit officially concluded, William received updates on the ongoing investigation of the Tanzania trafficking network that had provided such a powerful real-world demonstration of international cooperation potential. Additional arrests have been made in Kenya and Uganda based on intelligence gathered during the initial operation, suggesting that the network was even larger and more sophisticated than initially suspected. The success of the Tanzania operation provided concrete validation of the cooperation mechanisms developed at the summit, but it also revealed the enormous scale of the challenge that remained. Intelligence suggested that dozens of similar networks operated across Africa and Asia, requiring sustained effort and resources to combat effectively. William's final reflection as he left the Natural History Museum was on the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders and those of his fellow participants. The summit had created unprecedented opportunities for progress in wildlife protection, but Translating those opportunities into lasting change would require sustained commitment and continued innovation in the face of determined criminal opposition. The elderly elephant matriarch whose story had opened the summit 3 days earlier remained in his thoughts as a symbol of both the resilience of nature and the urgent need for human action. Her survival through decades of poaching pressure demonstrated that recovery was possible, but only with the kind of coordinated international effort that the summit had begun to create. 6 months after the United for Wildlife Global Summit, Prince William stood on the observation deck of a research station in Kenya's Masai Mara, watching a herd of elephants move slowly across the golden savanna in the early morning light. The scene looked peaceful, almost timeless, but William knew that the tranquility masked an ongoing battle between conservationists and criminal networks that continued to threaten these magnificent animals. He had returned to Kenya to assess the implementation of initiatives launched at the summit and to witness firsthand the impact of the international cooperation that had been forged in London. The 6 months since the summit had been a period of intense activity, with mixed results that reflected both the potential and the challenges of coordinating global conservation efforts. The morning began with a briefing from James Mwangi, the senior ranger who had spoken so powerfully at the summit about losing colleagues to poacher attacks. James had been promoted to lead a new rapid response unit equipped with advanced communication technology and night vision equipment funded through summit commitments. His team had successfully intercepted 7 poaching expeditions in the past 4 months, saving an estimated 50 elephants from ivory hunters. But James also reported sobering developments. The criminal networks had adapted to increased enforcement pressure by becoming more violent and sophisticated. Recent poaching attempts had involved military-style operations with automatic weapons and coordination equipment that suggested involvement by organized crime groups with substantial resources and training. The intelligence-sharing platform developed at the summit had proven invaluable in tracking these evolving threats. When unusual activity was detected in one area, automatic alerts enabled rapid coordination between park authorities, national law enforcement agencies, and international investigators. This system had prevented several major trafficking operations from succeeding, but it had also revealed the global scope of wildlife crime networks. William's next stop was a community conservancy where former poachers had been recruited as wildlife guides and park rangers. The transformation of these individuals from wildlife destroyers to protectors exemplified the summit's emphasis on addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of wildlife crime. Samuel Altayani had been one of the region's most notorious elephant poachers before being arrested 3 years earlier. Instead of facing a long prison sentence, he had been offered participation in a rehabilitation program that provided job training, psychological counseling, and opportunities to use his intimate knowledge of wildlife behavior for protection rather than destruction. Samuel now worked as a senior guide for ecotourism operations and as an advisor to anti-poaching units. His understanding of how criminal networks operated and his relationships within local communities had proven invaluable for prevention and investigation efforts. He had helped identify several planned poaching operations before they could be carried out, and his work with community education programs had reduced local support for wildlife crime. But Samuel's story also illustrated the ongoing challenges faced by community-based conservation programs. Economic pressures remained intense in rural areas where legitimate employment opportunities were limited. Young men continued to be recruited by criminal networks that offered immediate cash payments for participating in poaching operations, while conservation jobs provided steady but modest incomes that required patience and long-term thinking. The Conservation Impact Fund established at the summit had provided resources for expanding education and alternative livelihood programs, but demand far exceeded available funding. Community leaders consistently requested more support for schools, healthcare facilities, and economic development projects that would reduce vulnerability to recruitment by criminal organizations. Williams' visit to a technology center showcased some of the summit's most impressive achievements. The integrated monitoring system combining satellite imagery, acoustic sensors, and artificial intelligence had been deployed across 12 protected areas in East Africa, with remarkable results in early detection and prevention of wildlife crimes. The center's walls were covered with real-time displays showing wildlife movements, park ranger locations, and potential threat indicators across millions of acres of protected habitat. Operators could zoom in on specific areas where unusual activity had been detected, dispatch response teams to investigate suspicious signals, and coordinate with law enforcement agencies across multiple countries when cross-border operations were detected. Dr. Elizabeth Nyong-O, the center's director, demonstrated how the system had evolved since its initial deployment. Machine learning algorithms have become increasingly sophisticated at distinguishing between legitimate activities and potential threats, reducing false alarms while improving response times. The integration with community reporting apps had created a comprehensive early warning network that covered both high-tech monitoring and local human intelligence. But Dr. Nyong-O also outlined significant challenges that had emerged during implementation. The technology required substantial ongoing investment in maintenance, upgrades, and personnel training. Power outages and communication disruptions in remote areas regularly affected system performance. Most critically, the success of technological solutions depended on the capacity and commitment of human operators and field personnel who ultimately had to act on the intelligence generated. The afternoon brought William to a courthouse in Nairobi where some of the individuals arrested in the Tanzania operation that had unfolded during the summit were facing trial. The legal proceedings provided insight into both the achievements and limitations of international cooperation in prosecuting wildlife crime. The prosecutor, Margaret Wanjiku, had successfully argued for the extradition of several defendants to face charges in multiple countries where their criminal network had operated. This represented a significant breakthrough in international legal cooperation, made possible by treaties and information-sharing agreements developed through summit initiatives. The evidence presented in court demonstrated the sophisticated nature of modern wildlife trafficking operations. Encrypted communications, complex financial networks, and coordination across multiple countries had enabled the criminal organization to operate for years with minimal disruption. But the same international cooperation that had made their crimes possible had ultimately led to their capture and prosecution. However, the trial also revealed ongoing weaknesses in the legal response to wildlife crime. Several key witnesses had been intimidated or threatened, forcing them to withdraw their testimony or relocate for their safety. Corruption allegations against law enforcement officials had compromised some evidence. Defense attorneys with substantial resources were challenging every aspect of the prosecution's case, prolonging proceedings and increasing costs. Judge Robert Kaprotic, who was presiding over the case, explained to William how the summit initiatives had strengthened the legal framework for wildlife crime prosecution. New legislation provided enhanced penalties for trafficking offenses and improved tools for international cooperation. Specialized training for judges and prosecutors had increased expertise in handling complex wildlife cases. But Judge Kaprotic also emphasized the need for sustained support beyond the initial burst of post-summit activity. Legal system strengthening required long-term investment in personnel, training, and infrastructure. Success in individual cases needed to be built into broader patterns of effective prosecution that would deter future criminals. The day's most encouraging visit was to a wildlife veterinary clinic where Dr. Sarah Mthembu was treating animals rescued from trafficking operations. The clinic had been expanded and equipped with advanced medical equipment funded through summit commitments, enabling more sophisticated care for animals affected by wildlife crime. Dr. Mthembu showed William several rehabilitation success stories. A young elephant calf orphaned during a poaching attack had been successfully integrated into a new herd after months of intensive care and socialization. A rhinoceros whose horn had been partially removed by poachers had recovered sufficiently to be released back into the wild. Pangolins confiscated from trafficking networks have been nursed back to health and returned to protected areas. But the clinic also highlighted the ongoing trauma inflicted by wildlife crime. Many rescued animals suffered from psychological damage that required long-term treatment and careful rehabilitation. Some injuries were so severe that full recovery was impossible, leaving animals permanently disabled and unable to survive in the wild. The clinic had become a center for research into wildlife trauma treatment and rehabilitation techniques. Veterinarians from around the world came to learn from Dr. Mfembu's pioneering work, creating networks of expertise that enhance care for wildlife crime victims globally. William's evening was spent with a group of young conservation leaders who had participated in the summit's youth sessions. These individuals had returned to their home countries and communities to implement innovative projects that built on summit initiatives while addressing local priorities and conditions. Fatima Al-Zahra from Morocco had developed a mobile education program that brought conservation messages to rural schools throughout North Africa. Her team used interactive presentations, virtual reality experiences, and hands-on activities to teach children about wildlife protection while connecting local environmental challenges to global conservation efforts. Chen Wei from China had created an online platform that connected traditional medicine practitioners with conservation scientists to develop and promote synthetic alternatives to products derived from endangered species. The platform had attracted thousands of participants and had contributed to significant reductions in demand for rhino horn and pangolin scales in several major Chinese cities. Maria Santos from Brazil had established a network of indigenous communities working together to monitor and protect rainforest habitats critical for jaguar conservation. The network used satellite communication systems and GPS tracking to coordinate anti-poaching patrols across vast areas while preserving traditional ecological knowledge and cultural practices. These young leaders represented the next generation of conservation leadership, bringing energy, innovation, and technological expertise to wildlife protection efforts. But their projects also revealed the challenges of sustaining grassroots initiatives without ongoing institutional and financial support. Williams spent considerable time discussing how summit initiatives could better support youth-led conservation efforts. The young leaders consistently emphasized the need for long-term funding commitments, mentorship opportunities, and platforms for sharing knowledge and coordinating activities across different countries and regions. The final element of Williams' Kenya visit was a meeting with government officials responsible for implementing policy commitments made at the summit. Kenya had been one of the most active participants in summit initiatives, but implementation had revealed both successes and ongoing challenges. Environment Minister Keriako Tobiko outlined significant progress in strengthening Kenya's legal framework for wildlife protection. New legislation had increased penalties for poaching and trafficking offenses, enhanced tools for international cooperation, and provided better protection for park rangers and community conservationists. Prosecution rates for wildlife crimes had increased substantially, and several major trafficking networks had been dismantled. But Minister Tobiko also described persistent challenges that limited the effectiveness of policy reforms. Corruption remained a serious problem at all levels of government, undermining enforcement efforts and compromising investigations. Limited budgets constrained the expansion of ranger forces and the deployment of new technologies. Political pressures from communities affected by conservation restrictions continued to complicate policy implementation. The minister emphasized the critical importance of sustained international support for countries like Kenya that serve as front lines in the global fight against wildlife crime. Short-term project funding and conditional aid programs made long-term planning difficult while failing to address the systemic challenges that enabled wildlife trafficking. Williams' discussions with Kenyan officials reinforced themes that had emerged throughout his assessment visit. Summit initiatives had created unprecedented opportunities for progress in wildlife protection, but translating those opportunities into lasting change required sustained commitment and resources that went far beyond initial conference declarations. The most significant insight from the 6-month assessment was the complexity of measuring success in conservation efforts. Traditional metrics like reductions in poaching incidents or increases in wildlife populations provided important data, but they failed to capture the full impact of prevention efforts, community engagement initiatives, and capacity-building programs. Summit participants had developed more sophisticated evaluation frameworks that considered multiple dimensions of conservation impact. These included measures of international cooperation effectiveness, community participation levels, technological innovation deployment, and institutional capacity development alongside traditional wildlife population and crime statistics. The new evaluation approaches revealed that summit initiatives had achieved substantial progress in areas that were often invisible in conventional conservation assessments. Intelligence sharing had improved dramatically, enabling prevention of criminal activities that would never appear in crime statistics. Community engagement programs had reduced local support for poaching even in areas where enforcement remained limited. Technology deployments had created monitoring capabilities that provided early warning of emerging threats. But the assessment also revealed significant gaps between summit commitments and implementation realities. Financial pledges have been delivered inconsistently, with some donors providing full funding while others had reduced their contributions due to changed domestic priorities. Technology deployments had been slower than anticipated due to infrastructure limitations and training requirements. Legal system reforms had faced political opposition and bureaucratic resistance in several countries. As William prepared to return to London, he reflected on the lessons learned during his assessment visit and their implications for future conservation efforts. The summit had succeeded in creating a framework for international cooperation and had catalyzed significant new initiatives, but sustaining momentum would require ongoing attention and adaptation as circumstances changed. The elderly elephant matriarch whose story had opened the summit remained a powerful symbol, but William had come to understand that her survival represented not just individual resilience, but also the collective efforts of thousands of people working across multiple countries and sectors to protect wildlife. The summit had helped coordinate and strengthen those efforts, but the responsibility for ensuring their continuation rested with everyone who cared about preserving the natural world for future generations. His final morning in Kenya brought news that illustrated both the ongoing challenges and emerging opportunities in wildlife protection. A major trafficking network operating between Africa and Asia had been disrupted through intelligence sharing facilitated by summit initiatives, but investigations had revealed connections to even larger criminal organizations that would require years of sustained effort to combat effectively. At the same time, new partnerships between technology companies and conservation organizations were producing innovations that could dramatically enhance protection capabilities. Artificial intelligence systems were becoming more sophisticated at analyzing vast quantities of data for signs of wildlife crime. Genetic analysis techniques were providing unprecedented insight into trafficking patterns and criminal networks. Mobile communication systems were enabling real-time coordination between conservationists across vast geographic areas. The future of wildlife protection would be shaped by the ability to sustain and expand the cooperation framework created at the summit while adapting to evolving challenges and opportunities. Success would be measured not in any single dramatic breakthrough, but in the accumulated impact of thousands of coordinated actions taken by dedicated individuals working together across traditional boundaries and limitations. As William's plane lifted off from Nairobi Airport, he could see the vast landscapes below where the future of some of the world's most magnificent species would be determined. The summit had provided tools and partnerships that could make a decisive difference, but ultimately the outcome would depend on the continued commitment of people who understood that protecting wildlife was essential not just for the animals themselves, but for the kind of world that humans wanted to live in and pass on to their children.